Okay, so three types of unemployment are considered by economists. First one is called frictional unemployment, which arises from, as I said, frictions in the economy. And what are these frictions? Lack of information. So here we are considering a worker who has skills that are currently in demand. This is a worker who has skills. But it takes this worker a short amount of time to find the right job. Right? So let's say that you are a nurse or an engineer, somebody with skills that are in high demand in this economy, and you decide to move from Brownsville to Austin. Right? Now, when you arrive in Austin, it's going to take you a few weeks, perhaps, to find a job there. And in those few weeks, you will be considered to be frictionally unemployed. Now, the reason it takes you a couple of weeks to find a job there is because of this lack of information. You don't know where the right job is. You have to look for it. Right? In the same way, the employer who wants to hire you doesn't know where you are. And so the employer must engage in its own job search, looking for you. Right? And so it takes a short while for the two of you to meet up. And in this period, you were considered to be frictionally unemployed. Now, would you consider this to be a serious kind of unemployment? No. This is very short term, correct? Because we are talking about people who have skills that are in demand. The next kind of unemployment is called structural unemployment. And this is far more serious than frictional unemployment, structural unemployment. Now, this is unemployment that arises from the changing structure of the economy. Now, what is meant by the changing structure of the economy? Now, at the time of the formation of the US in the late 1700s, the US economy was an agrarian economy. Agriculture was the main industry, correct? And then in the 1800s, the US began to industrialize, correct? Perhaps a little after the Civil War, maybe slightly before it even, right? So we went from being an agrarian economy to being a manufacturing and an industrial economy. And now we are considered to be in a kind of a post-industrial phase, right? Our old industries are pretty much on their way out, right? And we have now begun concentrating on high technology areas and also services. So this is an example of the changing structure of our economy. Now, why do economies change their structure? Well, sometimes it is technological change that brings this about, a change in technology. And sometimes it's changing patterns of international comparative advantage. Remember that phrase, comparative advantage? Countries are supposed to make goods in which they have a comparative advantage, correct? There was a time when the US had a comparative advantage in making, let's say, clothing, garments, right? But the US has lost that comparative advantage to many other less developed countries now. Countries in Latin America, countries in Asia, etc. China. Right? So we have lost our comparative advantage in many of these manufacturing areas. Right? And that's why the structure of our economy is changing. Now, people who are laid off from industries that are dying as a result of these changes are considered to be structurally unemployed. Would you consider this a more serious unemployment than frictional unemployment? Yes, correct. Because these are people who don't have skills that are currently in high demand. Right? Consider a seamstress in a garment factory, somebody who, say, sews jeans or something. Right? And that factory is closed because those jobs have gone abroad. Now, this seamstress has one skill, and that is sewing jeans. Now, is that a skill that is likely to find her a new job in this economy? No. So in order for her to become employable again, what must she do? Get new skills, exactly. She has to be retrained in order to become employable again, which is where colleges like UTB and community colleges especially play a very important role in this type of retraining. Right? And economists have argued that our economy at present is going to be even more structurally unstable as time goes by. We are in the middle of this huge change. It's coming because of technological innovations. Lots of jobs that people used to do are now being done quite easily by machines, right? And this is going to throw a lot of people out of work. And so in order to become employable again, the average American, they say, will have to go back to school multiple times in his or her working life. So we all have to be prepared for that. Okay?
So that also counts people, well, that counts the people that get fired for having inferior skills, like not just the place's clothing. Like if they get fired because someone else has better.
No, that really wouldn't. No, that's different. Unless you say that his skills became viewed as inferior because of some type of technological change.
Like the international competition. What does that mean? Like what if someone else?
Yes, in comparison to a worker in China, say.
Oh, okay.
Right. So if you're a worker here and your productivity is X, and you're paid Y dollars every hour. But let's say we find a worker in China whose productivity is also X, but he can work for much less. Well, that makes you look bad, doesn't it?
But also, you're saying that only that you can pay someone else less. But what if that person, you pay them the same, but that other person does the job better?
Yes, that too.
That's the same thing?
That too, yes.
No.
Right. So that would be you looking bad in comparison to a worker abroad, let's say. So that is part of this changing pattern of comparative advantage. So the reason why he looks good is because that country now has a comparative advantage in this particular good. The last kind of unemployment is called cyclical unemployment, and this is unemployment that is related to the business cycle, which we know what the business cycle is, correct? The ups and downs of our economy, the ups and downs of real GDP, right? Cyclical unemployment. So this is the kind of unemployment that rises during economic recessions and falls during economic expansions. Now the government takes this kind of unemployment most seriously. The government takes this kind of unemployment most seriously. Why? Because unlike frictional unemployment, which really isn't a serious kind of unemployment, and unlike structural unemployment, which is serious, but is confined to only a few sectors of the economy, cyclical unemployment is unemployment that is across the board. This is unemployment that affects really everyone. Every job is affected by an economic recession. So the government takes cyclical unemployment most seriously. So here are our three kinds of unemployment. Now the first two, frictional and structural, make up what is called natural unemployment. So who are the naturally unemployed? They consist of the frictionally unemployed and the structurally unemployed. Now, why are these two kinds of unemployment considered to be natural? They are considered to be natural because the lack of information that led to frictional unemployment is considered to be a natural phenomenon. Also, changing technology and changing patterns of comparative advantage are also considered to be naturally occurring. Right? So natural unemployment is the kind of unemployment that would always exist, even when the economy is booming. Even when the economy is doing great, there will always be frictionally unemployed workers, those who are, say, moving from Brownsville to Austin, correct? They will always be there, right? And the seamstresses who are being laid off from factories that are closing, factories in sectors of the economy that are dying, basically, well, those kinds of workers will always be there. So the naturally unemployed are always going to be there, even in the best of times. You can never have zero unemployment, in other words. Right? And then we come to the concept of the natural rate of unemployment. And the natural rate of unemployment is basically the number of the naturally unemployed as a percentage of the labor force. And this in the US is believed to be about 4%. So what is that 4% then? The 4%, in other words, is a kind of a lower bound on the unemployment rate. The unemployment rate can never fall below that. Right? It can never fall below that because there will always be frictionally and structurally unemployed workers in the economy, even in the best of times. Right? So is it feasible to have a 0% unemployment rate? Answer? No. Now for the term full employment. Full employment occurs. We say that the economy has achieved full employment when the unemployment rate equals the natural unemployment rate. In other words, the unemployment rate is the lowest that it can be, in a sense. It's reached its lower bound. That's when we say the economy has achieved full employment. So when do we have full employment then? When the only unemployed are the naturally unemployed, meaning that there are no cyclically unemployed workers. So that is full employment. Now the natural unemployment rate depends on certain factors also here. First, it depends on the age distribution of the population. If you have a young population, this is going to mean that every year a large number of high school graduates and college graduates will be produced. If the economy is a young economy, meaning demographically speaking, that is, if there are lots of young people in this economy because of a high birth rate, then every year there are going to be large numbers of high school graduates and college graduates, meaning lots of new entrants into the labor force. And these guys are going to be considered frictionally unemployed, correct? It will take them a short amount of time to find the right job because of this lack of information that I spoke of. So if a young economy is likely to have more frictionally unemployed workers, and so a higher number of naturally unemployed workers, and therefore a higher natural rate of unemployment. Next, the pace of structural change. If an economy is undergoing rapid structural change, then this is going to lead to a large number of structurally unemployed workers, and this will bump up the number of the naturally unemployed and the natural rate of unemployment. Government policy plays a role here also. Unemployment benefits. If these are generous, if the unemployment benefits are generous, this is going to cause job searchers to prolong their job search. Is that correct? They, instead of being desperate and accepting the first job offer they get, generous unemployment benefits will enable workers to linger in unemployment for a longer period of time. Agreed? And so this too will bump up the natural unemployment rate. Correct? So these are the influences on the natural rate of unemployment. Potential GDP. This is a term that we have already defined in our last chapter. So what is potential GDP? This is the level of GDP when the economy is at full employment. It's the level of GDP when the economy is at full employment, meaning everyone in the labor force except the naturally unemployed is working. All resources are fully employed, in other words, except, of course, for the naturally unemployed, because they will always be there. It says here, when real GDP is below potential GDP, let's call potential GDP Y sub F. Another name for this is full employment real GDP. So it says here that when actual real GDP is below potential GDP, what must be true? Well, this must mean that the unemployment rate is above the natural unemployment rate. Why is that? Because remember, it takes workers to produce GDP. So if GDP is less than full employment real GDP, this must mean that employment is less than full employment. It takes less workers to make a smaller amount of GDP, correct? So if Y, actual GDP, is less than full employment GDP, this will mean that employment is less than full employment. And what does that mean? If employment is less than full employment? Well, this must mean that the unemployment rate is greater than the natural rate of unemployment. Am I making sense here? Right? So when this is true, this must mean that there are cyclically unemployed workers in addition to the naturally unemployed. So you have cyclically unemployed workers present in this situation. And this is going to cause the unemployment rate to be greater than 4%. 4% being the natural rate, the commonly believed natural rate for the US. On the other hand, it's sometimes possible for Y to be greater than YF. Now you might ask, how is that possible? Isn't YF Isn't potential GDP the level of GDP produced when everyone's working? Hang on, it's not everyone working. Remember, there is that pool of the naturally unemployed. So when do we have full employment? When 96% of the labor force is working. The 4% will always be there, correct? So is it possible then for the country's GDP to exceed its potential? It is, because you have that reserve pool of labor there, the naturally unemployed. So this is a situation where firms are so desperate for workers, for employees, that they go to laid off seamstresses, grab them, retrain them at company expense, and put them to work. Correct? So this is a situation where potential, where the GDP of the nation can exceed potential GDP. And in this case, of course, the unemployment rate shall, in a sense, dip below the natural rate. So you could have an unemployment rate of 3%. It's possible. And this is when desperate companies desperate for workers, are dipping into the pool of the naturally unemployed. The output gap. The output gap is pretty much equal to y minus yf expressed as a percentage. So it's this gap here expressed as a percentage of potential GDP. Now, if this is a negative number, if that were a negative number, what would that mean? That means that y is less than yf, correct? And if y is less than yf, what is the implication for the unemployment rate? The unemployment rate must be greater than the natural rate, correct? So this is a recession, basically. So a negative output gap means recession. On the other hand, if this output gap were positive, that's when y is greater than yf, and this implies that the unemployment rate is less than 4%. It's less than the natural rate. Okay? And that brings us to the end of chapter 6. And without wasting time, I'm going to launch into chapter 7, because chapter 7 is a bit lengthy, and I will not be able to cover it in one class.